Hello and welcome back to STARNES'S storeroom. Tonight's topic is going to be on 3 classic World War II era weapons which armed our troops throughout the war.
But the gun that helps our men to keep their tails up today is the Bren, a nasty little Spitfire that can spew out bullets at the rate of 480 rounds a minute. Loading is by magazine holding 30 rounds, a matter of 2 seconds.
The Bren Gun entered service in the late 1930s and was a series of light machine guns. This weapon fulfilled many different roles in the British Armed Forces, as well as Commonwealth and many countries outside of the Commonwealth during and after the Second World War. As well as seeing widespread use in the Second World War and the Korean War, the Bren also saw service throughout the later half of the 20th century, serving in the Falklands and the Persian Gulf War, these being the later rebarrelled 7.62 L4 variant. The Bren you're looking at here is a Mark I Bren, which was first introduced in September of 1937. The original was based on a Czechoslovak weapon. This is where it gets its name from, being an acronym from Bruno, where the Czech gun was made, and Enfield, where the British adaptation was made. The Bren has a simple gas-operated system and fires the tried and trusted British 303 round. It's a 30-round magazine-fed weapon, which gives it a slower rate of fire in comparison to, say, the belt-fed MG34. This does, however, stop the barrel from overheating too quickly. Even when the barrel does become overheated, it can be easily interchangeable, unlike the Browning automatic rifle, for example, which has a fixed barrel. The process of removing the barrel is very simple. By pulling the locking lever and the wooden handle, you can simply slide away a very hot barrel from the receiver. You can actually see how interchangeable these barrels are. As I stated earlier, this is a Mark I Bren, but I'm sure some of you eagle-eyed viewers have spotted it has a Mark II barrel. The Bren Mark I has some quite noticeable features which we'll now be looking at. It has a folding cocking handle which will now demonstrate a dry fire. It has a drum pattern rear aperture sight. It has a butt strap for use over the shoulder when firing. The Mark I has a telescoping bipod, however this has had the later Mark II fixed bipod fitted. A fitting for a rear grip under the butt. Although it's obvious I've never used the Bren in the heat of battle, I do consider it to be a very effective weapon, having a fairly simple magazine and barrel change, and also has a slower rate of fire with a cyclic rate of 500 rounds per minute. I do also have a little bit of feedback from someone who has used it in the heat of battle, a member of No. 4 Commando saying, "The Bren was a good weapon, but if you fired it too long and too quick, the barrel heated up, and the accuracy decreased when that happened. Most of the boys just urinated on the barrel to cool it down. This is one of the weapon's greatest strengths, is its simplicity of operation." So that's the Bren anyway. I don't think I'll be practicing some of the techniques they use to cool it down anytime soon, but it's an interesting piece of information nonetheless. The Lee Enfield No. 4 Mark I was officially adopted in 1941. It is essentially still an SMLE, having the same magazine, the same bolt and the same stripper clip feed. Unlike the SMLE that had a nose cap, the No. 4 Lee Enfield barrel protruded from the end of the forestock, this being the most noticeable difference. The Lee Enfield No. 4 was used throughout the majority of the Second World War, being one of the main rifles of the British Armed Forces and Commonwealth. It would go on to serve the British Armed Forces in many other conflicts such as the Korean War, and remained the standard rifle in the British Armed Forces until 1957. As you can see, it's a bolt-action rifle and uses the 303 round like the Bren as mentioned earlier. It's got a cartridge capacity of 10 rounds and a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,438 feet per second and a rate of fire of around 15 to 20 rounds per minute. We'll now demonstrate a dry fire. The No. 4 rifle was heavier than the older previous SMLE. This is largely due to its heavier barrel. Also, a new spike bayonet was designed to go with the new rifle. This was essentially a steel rod with a sharp point and was nicknamed the pig sticker by the troops. Other bayonets would also be designed and produced, such as the post-war No. 7 and No. 9 blade bayonet. I think the rifle is great. It's a very smooth to operate bolt action weapon, and when required you can get many rounds down range. Interestingly, this particular Enfield is stamped US property. This rifle was built and supplied to Britain under the Lend-Lease programme during the Second World War. I may add that none of these US Savage Lee Enfields were ever issued to the US military. The marking only served to the main pretense that American equipment was being lent to the UK rather than permanently sold to them. What you're looking at here is a Mark II Sten gun. This is the most common variant, having 2 million units produced. To give you a little bit of background behind this weapon, the idea came not long after Dunkirk, around the time of the Battle of Britain. The country was in a frantic search for a submachine gun, as before the Sten gun came about, the British were relying on a very expensive US-made Thompson submachine gun. Many trials were conducted at an astonishingly fast rate to find a weapon that could be cheap and simple to produce. Around August of 1941, the Sten gun Mark II was produced and began to enter service. These submachine guns, like the Bren and Lee Enfield, went on to be used throughout the British Armed Forces, as well as many Commonwealth and non-Commonwealth nations, and wouldn't leave service for many of these nations until the 1960s. The Sten was very much cheap and easy to manufacture. It could be produced in around 5 hours and was made up of as little as 47 parts. The Sten fires a 9mm round from an open bolt, and when the trigger is pulled, the bolt slams into the back of the cartridge, which creates a large amount of noise, and then blowback then occurs, and the bolt is blown back. This means you are creating a hell of a lot of noise. It had a very minimalist design, which meant it could be operated without the use of lubrication. This was a good feature, meaning it could be operated in many different environments, such as the deserts where oil attracts dust and can cause jams. The Sten is capable of firing 550 rounds per minute. However, I'm not the biggest fan of the Sten. Like I said earlier, its firing mechanism was rather noisy and handling it was somewhat clunky, having an awkwardly designed pistol grip and a 30-round magazine that would jam when handling it, which made this a common occurrence. The Sten was undoubtedly a workhorse of its time. However, this did not prevent it from gaining a bad reputation with the soldiers. Some of the descriptions were maybe not what the designers would have wanted to hear, being called the Woolworth Special, the Plumber's Delight, and my personal favourite, the Stench Gun. Here's a rather interesting report which helps you construct an idea of what soldiers thought of the weapon. I quote, "Soldiers later on in the war purposely threw locked and loaded Sten guns through windows so the weapon would start firing on impact. This would terrify and scatter everyone in the room before another Tommy kicked the door open." End quote. Also, an interesting fact, the name Sten is an acronym. The S is from Shepherd and the T is from Turpin, both the designers, and EN from Enfield being the manufacturer. Okay, so that was really just a brief discussion on 3 of the most common weapons used by the British Armed Forces in the Second World War. Eventually, I'll be looking at them individually and it'll be a more in-depth look. But until then, remember to like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you on the next one.